All right, as we said, we are starting a brand new series this morning through a brand new book of the Bible, and it is the Old Testament book of Daniel. Daniel. In fact, why don't you turn to Daniel, because we're going to be reading in it today, and Daniel is right after Ezekiel, which is one of the longest books of the Bible. So if you find Ezekiel, you just move forward one book to Daniel. If you have your Bible in front of you, you can just turn to page 737. So that will even get you easier, but you'll need to keep that open. Now, Daniel is an exciting book because it contains some of the most miraculous stories in all the Bible, from fiery furnaces, the lion's den, to the finger of God actually writing on a wall, which is pretty cool. But the book of Daniel is equally remarkable for its prophecies that rival the book of Revelation. And we're going to get into some of those things, and there's lots of speculation about some of those prophecies and what they talk about. Now, the book of Daniel is nice because it can be simply divided into two halves. In fact, the first 6 chapters of Daniel read as a narrative, while the last 6 chapters of Daniel is where Daniel shares prophecies given to him by God of events that were fulfilled in the years that follow him, and other prophecies that he shared that are still to come that point to the return of Jesus. So it's kind of an interesting book in that way, that it contains both narrative and prophecy. And we're going to look at all of that during our journey through this book. Now, Daniel, again, writes this book, and it's about him. And this story of Daniel is written, and it takes place during a very dark time for God's people, because they are in captivity. And it takes place, it spans from when they're taken into captivity in the Babylonian Empire all the way into the Medo-Persian Empire, which were some of the greatest empires this world has ever known. And it takes place through these years. And Daniel and many others from Judah, the nation of Judah, they were taken from their homes and from their families and their place of worship of God, and they were taken into this strange land with foreign customs, with different people and different gods that they worshipped. So what becomes of them? What would become of them when they're taken into this place? What would happen to their heritage and their faith of God? Would they be molded by this world that they're put into, or will they stand firm and faithfully impact their world? Well, these are the questions of Daniel, but they're not just questions for Daniel. They're questions for us today, because much like the world that Daniel goes into, that's a lot like our world is today, that it stands against God and it's far from our home in heaven, yet we're placed here to live. And as our world today stands opposed to God and his people, is just like the one that Daniel faced. And as we look at Daniel, then, we're going to discover some incredible stories in the life of Daniel, some miracles, and also God's going to share with us some hope, that hopefully as we learn about these things, we'll find strength and to live boldly and faithfully for God in our own world today. So it's a very practical book, and it's very timely for the world in which we live. And Daniel, it's more than a story of just a man. Actually, Daniel is all about God, and it's all about a faithful and powerful God who holds us up and calls us to be faithful to him, because he is faithful to us. So with this in mind, we're going to dive into Daniel. That's kind of just a brief little background of the book of Daniel. And we're going to dive into chapter 1. We're going to read the first 7 verses this morning. But before we do, it starts right off the bat, and we need to kind of discover how we get to the point of the opening of Daniel, so we understand events that lead up to and why what happens in Daniel happens. So we're going to do a quick history lesson, and hopefully it'll be quick, because I love this history stuff. But anyway, we're going to go back in looking at how we get to the point of the beginning of Daniel. We're going to go back from the writing of Daniel, or these events of Daniel, some 1,500 years back, to a man named Abram. You remember Abram? God called this man Abram to come, and he says, I want you to follow me, and I'm going to take you to this land of promise. And as part of that, God gives a promise to Abram. And he says, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to give you descendants. And through you and your descendants, every nation of the earth will be blessed. And in that, God is also promising the Messiah, Jesus, to come through the line of Abraham. And then over the years, as God gives Abraham a family and this promise starts to come to fruition, his family grows, they end up having to go to Egypt. And they're enslaved in Egypt now, and they become a great nation and very numerous, but they become enslaved by the Egyptians for 400 years in captivity. Then God rises up Moses to lead his people out, and that's the Exodus, right? And then when they leave Egypt, 40 years later, they're on the doorstep of God's promised land for them. And before they enter the promised land, God gives another covenant. He goes, now, I want to do another covenant with you, but this is a two-way. It's not just my promise to you. Here it is. You need to be faithful to me and faithful in worshiping me. And as long as you are, I will prosper you in this land I'm about to give you. But if you are unfaithful to me and follow other gods, I'll remove you from this land. And it's very important that we get that before they enter the land. So then Joshua leads the people in, and they conquer the land, but they don't conquer it completely. So then there's a remnant of these foreign gods and things like that. And sure enough, as God's people do, and as we tend to do, we slip up. And God's people begin worshiping other gods. And there's this tension that happens. And eventually the people say, you know what? We see this keep happening, and we keep falling away. If we had a king like other nations, we would be fine. So God says, all right, I'll give you a king. And they want King Saul. And then he fails. So then God raises up David, and the nation prospers. And then David's son Solomon, again, prospers, but he has his struggles. But the nation grows into a world power by the point of Solomon. But after Solomon dies, his sons and some of the people of the nation begin to fight, and there's a civil war. And this land then divides into two nations. There's 10 of the 12 tribes are part of the northern kingdom then, and they call themselves Israel. And then the southern kingdom is made up of 2 of the tribes, Judah and Benjamin, and they become Judah. So you have this history, and now each of those nations now have their own king. And we know that the Messiah is going to come through Judah, but we have Israel too. So as kings then begin to go, and as Israel, the new nation of Israel, these 10 tribes, they have kings, and every one of their kings are unfaithful to God, and they're evil, and they're increasingly evil, to the point there are 19 kings in Israel, and every one of them is evil. And sure enough, God, faithful to his promise, he brings in the Assyrian Empire in 722 BC, and they're conquered. And Israel ceases to exist as a nation from that point forward in this way. And they take them out into captivity and defeat the nation. However, Judah has 20 kings through their history. And many of their kings are evil, but they also have some kings that are faithful to God. Kings like Uzziah and Jotham. And there's another one named Josiah. If you've ever heard of Josiah becomes king as a young boy, and he goes into the temple, and his men find the books of the law in the temple, and he reads them, and says, we need to get back to this worship of God. And there's a reformation in Judah that happens because of Josiah, and the people come back to worshiping God, and they begin flourishing. And as time goes by, the nation is there, and Egypt is one of the world powers at that point. And they're always kind of attacking Israel, Judah, and things like that. And Josiah takes his men out to battle against Necho, the king, the pharaoh of Egypt. And Josiah is mortally wounded in this battle. And this is in 609 BC. And what he does before he dies is he says, I want my son to become king. And his name is Jehoahaz. He says, my son Jehoahaz needs to be king. He's going to be faithful to God. So Jehoahaz comes to power. But Egypt now, who defeated Israel, but they didn't conquer them, but they defeat them, and they're getting taxes paid to them. And the Pharaoh says, I don't want Jehoahaz in power. So 3 months after he reigns, the Pharaoh comes in and says, I'll put somebody in, one of Josiah's sons, and puts another son named Jehoiakim in power. In 609 BC. And Jehoiakim is an evil king. He worships other God. He defames God's name wherever it goes. So that's kind of where we are right now. 609, Jehoiakim comes into power, and now the book of Daniel opens. Okay, I know that was a little long and winding road, but we need to get this to understand what's happening here at the beginning of Daniel. So let's read then. Let's begin reading Daniel. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed vessels in the treasury of his God. And what we're going to find here, so now it's 605 BC, and God sends Nebuchadnezzar and this new power, the Babylonian Empire, to come and attack and defeat Judah and King Jehoiakim. And it's interesting because the Assyrians conquered nations a lot different than Babylon did. The way the Assyrians would attack, they would come in and it would be scorched earth and they would kill everybody. But then what they would do to the people that they would conquer is they would scatter them throughout their empire and say, if we scatter them, then nobody will have any culture anymore and they'll never be able to rise up against us. In fact, remember when we went through James and James says this book is written to the Jewish diaspora? Do you remember that word? That means 10 scattered tribes. He's talking about what happened to God's people when they were defeated by the Assyrians. That's why Samaria was kind of this half-breed. Remember during the days of Jesus, they weren't full Jews because they were all scattered and they intermarried with other people. So that's how Assyria would attack people. And they would scatter, and they'd say, well, we're going to weaken that way. Babylon was different. They would come in and besiege a place, and then they would just take select things back to Babylon. And they would leave weaker people there, but they would take good things, and they would try to indoctrinate and win over the people rather than divide them. And they said, we'll just make them into Babylonians. They'll love us. And so that's the way Babylon kind of took power. So that's what we see happening here. And you'll notice here, it's very interesting because it says Nebuchadnezzar brought them to the land of Shinar. Now, this is where Babylon is. Modern-day Babylon is in modern-day Iraq, is where Babylon was, with the Tigris and Euphrates River. And it was a city that was a huge area, but the walled city, was 14 miles square. 14 miles by 14 miles by 14 miles by 14 miles. It was a big city. Right? And it was built in what's called the land of Shinar. Now, it's interesting because Babylon is mentioned more than any other city in all the Bible, except one. You know what that city is? Jerusalem. So you have Jerusalem, the place of the worship of the one true God. It's the city of God. Now you have Babylon, which is mentioned all these times. But yet here in Daniel 1, it says the land of Shinar. Now, you might remember that, or you might have never heard that. I'm going to tell you, the Bible talks about this land of Shinar one other place. Do you know where? Genesis chapter 11. Do you know what happens in Genesis chapter 11? It's after the flood, and the people of the earth start to increase, and they all share one language. And they come together and say, there's nothing impossible for us. Let's build a tower that reaches to heaven so that we can show our prowess. You remember what God says? Oh, no, you don't. And he confused their language, and the tower ceased to exist. That was called the Tower of Babel. This is where Babylon is. It was a tower made in man's honor. So you have Jerusalem, which represents the city of God. Now you have Babylon, which represents the city of man, or man's way. And Babylon at this time of Nebuchadnezzar had more idols and other god worship than any other city in all the world. So it was just a horrible place, a godless place for the one true worship of God. And Nebuchadnezzar. Now, we continue. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of nobility, youths without blemish and good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. And we're going to talk all about what this is all about and what's happening. But this is how the conquering of Judah happened. And actually, this is the first conquering of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar actually comes in 3 times over 20 years to take more of this land of Judah until he finally just burns it to the ground. But this is like the first wave of attack, and he just takes select people back, again, to indoctrinate them into Babylonian culture. Now, this is an important passage for us to grasp before we go further into Daniel next week, and we start to look at some of these things, not only the events, but also the prophecies that Daniel talks about, because it not only sets a stage for the rest of Daniel, but it also, this passage this morning reveals 2 key concepts that we must understand in order for us to live faithfully in our world today, which is really what we're talking about, right? Living as strangers in a strange land. And how do we live faithfully with God? Well, in this opening passage, it kind of gives us that theme and gives us these concepts. And the first concept we need to know about, or that this passage talks about, is it talks about the nature of evil. How bad evil is. If we want to live for God in our world today, we need to understand what evil is all about, if we're going to call our world evil or against God. The presence of evil in our world can have a major effect on the way we live our lives. So it's important to understand, first of all, that evil is real. Do you know that? Evil is a real thing. Sometimes we like to deny that. We like to think that we live in a world where everybody's good and everybody has good intentions and everybody has everybody's best out for people. And sometimes we get in this world and we start to think like that. This is not. Evil is, we live in a fallen world since the time when Adam and Eve sinned against God. And sin enters the world along with death. Evil comes into our world. Not only are we born into sin and we can do evil acts ourselves, but evil and our evil world fights against God and all that is good, including his people. In fact, that's what Jesus told his disciples. You remember in John chapter 15 when he's talking about the abiding in him. And wow, isn't it great to abide in him and to share with what he shares? And then Jesus says this, you know what, followers of me? If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. Jesus tells his disciples, he tells followers of him that if we follow him, the world is going to fight against us. It's going to hate us because it fought against God and it continues to fight against God. And when he's saying if the world hates you, he's not saying this could happen. It's more when you're hated by the world, know that it hated me first. When you come across opposition. You see, Satan and his forces, they will try to do all they can to derail God's people and God's work. And we're fooling ourselves if we think we can avoid it. And if we think that we aren't capable of evil, or we aren't susceptible to evil being done to us. So it's important that we don't take the reality of evil lightly, thinking that it's not a big deal or that it's not dangerous. And sometimes that's what we do. And that can be very dangerous. This is what got the kings of Judah and Israel in so much trouble, because they dabbled in evil. And it kept getting worse and worse. And they scoffed at calls to stand against it and to stand up for God. In fact, do you know what? God sent the prophets for that very purpose. Do you know over 100 years before Babylon comes in and defeats Judah, God raised up a prophet, Isaiah. And Isaiah served under 2 godly kings, Uzziah and Jotham. And then there was a king named Ahaz who was evil. And God sends Isaiah to Ahaz and says, I want you to give this message. And this is in Isaiah chapter 13, so you can look it up. He says, I'm sending Babylon to come and get you. Babylon wasn't even an empire at this point. But he says, I will rise up Babylon, and they will come, and they will conquer you if you don't turn. And then 2 years before Babylon comes in, he raised up another prophet named Habakkuk to go to Jehoiakim, who was openly mocking God. And he says to Habakkuk, he says, there's going to be a day coming where you can't even imagine the work of God that's going to happen. Because I'm going to send Babylon to come in and utterly destroy you. 2 years before. And you know what the kings did? They scoffed at it. And they said, nah, it's not that bad. Evil in opposition against God and his people, that's a reality. It's a reality in the world then, and it's a reality in our world now. And we should take it serious. You see, because if we leave a small crack for evil, evil will rush in. And we see that through the nation of Israel. And where we endure and we affirm or we entertain evil, that will just rush in. Evil will always shape and consume us if we don't actively stand against it. Do you know that? It will overtake us if we don't stand against it. It's not just like, oh, it won't hurt us if we don't think it's there. And now not only is evil real, but evil is destructive. And that's something else we see here in these first few verses of Daniel. Evil will destroy everything that is good and precious to God. In fact, this is what those who endorse and practice evil will do. They'll try to take everything about God and destroy it. The presence of evil, it doesn't just leave the door open for Babylon, but then King Nebuchadnezzar sows his teeth and his evil as he comes in and defeats Judah and the destructive nature of his evil. You see, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't a good guy. He was an evil guy. He worshiped other gods, and he was brutal in his rule, and he was calculated in the way he had victory. And if we look at our passage again, we see some of these evil acts of Nebuchadnezzar where we see how destructive it is and how he's trying to destroy what God has made precious. And we see it first in the second verse. We see that as he comes in, he goes into the temple of God and he takes select items out of the temple of God. Right? Look at verse 2. It says, some of the vessels of the house of God, he brought them back to his land and put them in the temples of his gods. You see, what he's doing, he's taking that which God made holy and he's defaming it. And he's also saying, my gods are better than your God. In fact, they're going to come and serve my God. And he takes these cups and these bowls and things like that, and he puts them in his temple in service of his gods. Talk about destroying God. And I'll tell you what, later on in Daniel, we're going to see that his son did even worse. But it's not just temple worship or temple objects that were used for worship, though, that he also tries to ruin. Look what he does in verse 3. We have this Ashpenaz is told to take select young men. A select few. These are young men of royal households, somewhere between the age of 14 to 18. So Daniel, when he's taken, is probably between 15 and 17 years old. So think about that. But these young men are without blemish, right? They're physically healthy. They're educated. They're cultured. These are people of nobility. These are people, they're not religious leaders, kids. What they are is they're the people, the politicians, and the business leaders in Judah. So they have every advantage they could possibly have, and they're already being educated well, and they're sharp. And they pick these young men out, and they take them. Not to be used in Judah, but to be used for Babylon's benefit. Because what Nebuchadnezzar does is he says, I'm going to take these guys that God raised up for his country, I'm going to take them and use them for my benefit, and I will indoctrinate them, put them in a 3-year school where it's not that they're going to be educated, they're going to be indoctrinated in the hopes that they will become Babylonian at the end of these 3 years. And he can use these skilled men to benefit his empire. Again, this is trying to devalue God's purpose and his provision for Judah by taking his purposes and devaluing it for himself. And then there's a final thing of evil that Babylon took that was precious to God here that we learn about. Look at verse 6 and 7. It's the very names of these men of Judah. You see, names for us today, we name people. We name our kids things you can find at license plates at rest stops and things like that, or they sound cute, or they're spelled some weird way. And when that's how we name our kids. Back with God's people, names meant something. They were actually a witness of God and his goodness and his faithfulness. So names were given to people back then that were God's people to reveal and celebrate God. So Nebuchadnezzar comes in and says, we're going to take these names that are meant to honor God and we're going to change them to honor my gods. So he takes these and mentions these 4 guys that they take, right? Daniel. You know what Daniel's name means in Hebrew? It means God is my judge, or God protects his people. And they rename him, the Babylonian name, Belteshazzar, which means Bel, who's one of the gods of Babylon. Bel protect his life. So now he's a servant now of Babylonians' gods. Hananiah means the Lord shows grace, but his new name, Shadrach, means the command of Aku, or Aku is in charge, who's the moon god of Babylon. Mishael means who is like God, and he's renamed Meshach, which means who is as Aku is, this moon god. And then Azariah means the Lord is my help, but Abednego means servant of Nebo, another one of the Babylonian gods. Do you see how he took those names, what God meant for good, and to reveal him and to serve as a witness forever of God's goodness and his faithfulness? And evil says, no, we'll take that name and we'll give you a new name. We'll give you your identity. Pretty scary, isn't it? The name of the true and living God was replaced by names of false gods of Babylon. And such is the nature of evil. And we need to grasp this. But it's not just something that happened back then. It happens today. And this will always be the end goal of evil, to destroy God and his work. In fact, we see it in our society today, don't we? We see how our world stands opposed to God, and it tries to destroy all that is precious to God and all that God has made precious and perfect. And you may be sitting here, well, how does our world do that today? Let me give you a few examples. First, time. It's a big thing in our world today, isn't it? We're all run by time. Well, you know, God is the creator of time. And God created time to be stewarded by us to use for worship of him and for working for him, to be productive for God. And you look at what our world has done with time. People spend time, rather than that, being entertained by either sports or certain TV shows that aren't honoring to God. Or we waste our time rather than use our time scrolling on our phones, looking for nothing. See, our world has taken our time, or tries to take our time, which God makes holy. Something else, human life. Again, the jewel of God's creation, right? He created man and mankind in his own image. The only thing created in God's own image. And we try to destroy that at the name of convenience with abortion. And we just throw it away. Things like purity. You know, God's created purity, especially sexual purity, to be used of the greatest picture of Christ in us, which is marriage. And this pleasure in sex is to be kind of the celebration of that joining together. And it's a beautiful thing. Yet in our world today, what do? We cheapen it. We cheapen sex and say, well, just do it. Doesn't matter who with, just do it. And we cheapen purity that God created to be precious and something to be held onto and cherished. And even, you know what? The way God creates us is under attack today. We see gender under attack. God places in us exactly who he's made us to be. The DNA, we're crafted together and woven together in our mother's womb, is what Psalm 139 says. And he's made us just who he's made us to be for his purposes, so that we can get to know him and we can be fulfilled in who he's made us to be. And look what our world's done to that. It's told a lie to people that says, you know what, if you're not happy in who you are, try to be someone else, because then you can finally be satisfied and happy. And what we're finding in that is we have a whole society of people that don't know who they are, and every time they try to be who they think will make them happy, it doesn't. Why? Because they're not being who God has made us to be and discovering our value to him. that we are precious. And that's only where we'll find satisfaction, is through God made us to be. You see, so much of our world seeks to devalue what God has made and declared precious, and it will cause many to lose sight of God and his goodness. And we see that in our world today, don't we? This is the same thing that was going on when Nebuchadnezzar took the people into Babylon. And this is the nature of evil. It paints a very dark picture, doesn't it? Woohoo! This is great. Let's go through Daniel. But it's not the whole picture. It's seemingly hopeless, yet there's another reality present here in these verses that, in the rest of Daniel, that overwhelms all evil, and that's the nature of God. We see the nature of God present in these verses as well, because in understanding the nature of God, we need to be reminded that, first of all, God is in control. God is the one who is in control. There is no evil too great or terrible that God isn't bigger than. Evil is not in control. God is. In fact, that's something we shouldn't miss in the defeat of Judah. If we look back at this, look at the beginning of verse 2. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar comes in and he takes Babylon and he besieges it. But verse 2 says, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. As great and as powerful as Nebuchadnezzar thought he was, as great a strategy as he employed, it was powerless to defeat God's people unless God allowed it. You understand that? God gave his people into the hand of the Babylonians. They weren't randomly defeated, but given over, just as he said he would do, didn't he? He said, hey, if you're unfaithful to me, this is what's going to happen. And this is much like what happened with Job. If we look at the book of Job, and if you've ever looked at the book of Job, Job's a man who followed after God. And God said, look at his faithfulness. And Satan says, he's only faithful to you because he's got good things. Allow me to test him. See, Satan couldn't touch Job unless God allowed it. And he tests Job, and he finds that Job's faith is real. But God is in charge. God can wipe out all evil in an instant. He can wipe out any evil that comes against us in life. Do you know that? So if we're still facing evil, it's because God's allowing it, and God has a purpose and a plan. You know, God may be allowing evil to drive us back to himself. He may allow evil into our lives to set us apart as a testimony of faithfulness. Or he may allow evil into our lives and bad things to happen to us so that others can come to faith in him. But know this, God is in control. Nothing happens unless he causes it or allows it for his purposes. And you may say, wow, that's pretty harsh. Well, there's something else about God's nature that we also see with this. Not only is he in control, but God is also faithful. And God is always faithful. And we learn, first of all, through our passage, that God is a faithful judge. Right? Removal from the land, it was a consequence of not staying faithful to God in the covenant made through Moses. And God will faithfully bring to judgment all evil when it's needed most. Even if it's evil that we do. And you might say, well, that's a bad thing that God's our judge. No, it's a beautiful thing that God is a judge, that he doesn't leave evil to go unpunished. It's a beautiful thing because God will not allow us to go astray so far that he can't bring us back. We learned about that in the sheep of Christmas, didn't we? As the good shepherd, and he goes and he leaves the 99 to come for the one. You see, that's God as a faithful judge and coming to bring us back. In fact, Hebrews talks about this, and sometimes we face discipline. We say, I don't like discipline, but it's God's faithfulness to us. In fact, the writer of Hebrews says, for our fathers disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful and rather than pleasant, but later it yields a peaceful fruit of righteousness. You know what that is? The fruit of the Spirit. That's what is produced in our life through God's faithfulness in this way to those who've been trained by it. And God not only will prove faithful to judge it in our own lives, to kind of keep us back to himself, but God will prove faithful to take care of evil that's done to us. Do you know that? It may not be in our lifetime, but God will deal with all evil. So those that do evil to us, or those we see in our world that are doing evil, God's got that. He releases us from trying to worry about that or trying to get revenge in all that. God says, God will avenge. He's the judge, and he's the faithful one. Evil will not win. In fact, that battle for evil has already been won by Jesus. And as we'll see later in Daniel, Jesus will ultimately prove victorious when he comes again over all evil. Again, God wins, and he's faithful in that. It's already complete. It's already done. And not only do we see God faithful to judge, we also see God as faithful to protect and preserve in these verses. Do you know God's faithful to protect and preserve? Look at what he does. He removes these men from the land of Judah, and he places them, yes, in this evil world, but you know what else this world is? It's probably the safest place for them to be because they have all of their needs taken care of. They have good accommodations, and they have good care. You see, in this, God is keeping them as a remnant, and he's keeping them safe, and he's proving himself faithful to keep them a remnant who, when they're faithful to them, will then pass on God's promises and hope to future generations. Isn't that what he does with Daniel? He protects Daniel, brings him aside so that he can give Daniel his word, so that Daniel can speak God's word into eternity. In fact, at the end of the book, Daniel says this, and those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the sky above. Those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. God's faithfulness brings Daniel to that place of influence where he can lead many to righteousness. And it'll blow your mind what he does in this book and how God uses him in this way. So this is Daniel. This is our introduction to Daniel. Hopefully you're excited about this, where we meet not only evil, but we meet a God who is good and faithful and always in control. So this is where Daniel and his three friends find themselves as we begin this journey in Daniel. And they're met head on with overwhelming evil as they begin to live as strangers in a strange land. How will they respond? We're going to find out. But better yet, since this is like us today, how will we respond in our world today when we see evil come upon us? You know, as we'll see in the lives and what happens in Daniel, we'll also see maybe some of the challenges that face us. You see, some may face evil and see the face of evil and give up. You know what that means? We surrender to a world that presses against our faith, and rather than trying to impact our world, we shrink back from it. Some may want to give in. That's different than giving up. You know what giving in means? We compromise ourselves. We compromise and try to live the best of both worlds, but find that compromise just waters everything down and there's nothing we can stand on. Yet there are some like Daniel and his friends, and like we're called to hold fast, to dig in. Those who cling to God and his ways no matter the cost, who courageously stand up in sharp contrast to the world around them. And that's what we're going to find in Daniel. So this book and story of Daniel, it's of one who holds fast to God in the midst of a world that is far from him. And in this, Daniel's for us. And that's why we're going through Daniel, because we're called to live lives of impact right where we are in our world, as strangers in a strange land. However, like Daniel, and as we're going to see with Daniel, as great as Daniel was, we need to understand he's not strong enough to hold fast in his own strength. He's not good enough. Neither are we. You see, when our faith, like Daniel's faith, is anchored in the immovable, that's when we find strength in our faith. Do you know what the immovable is? The faithfulness of God. Then we will not be moved. You see, like Daniel's living as strangers in a strange land, and here's the whole theme of the book of Daniel in one sentence. We can remain faithful to God in an unfaithful world because our God is supremely faithful. You have that? Here's what we're going to learn through this journey through Daniel, that we can remain faithful to God in the midst of our world, not because we're good enough or we have, we summon something up in ourselves, but rather because we experience and we rely on the faithfulness of God. You see, the story of Daniel isn't about a man, it's about a faithful God. So next week, what we're going to do is we're going to begin jumping into the book of Daniel and to see how God proves himself faithful. And we'll see the courageous faith of these four men as they hold fast next week. But even more than that, we'll come face to face with our God who is supremely faithful. He was faithful then, and he'll be faithful for us today so that we can hold fast in him and make an impact in our world. So that's our journey ahead. Are you excited? It's going to be a lot of fun. Daniel's a hard book, let me tell you. And we're going to dig into Daniel, and we're going to discover some things, and we're going to come to some things where we say, we just don't know. But you know what? That's going to be okay too, because God is always faithful. So if we leave with nothing else today, that's what we need to leave with in looking at the book of Daniel. So let's pray.